Sit down.
Are we ready, Joe? Am I my mic on? All right, turn to someone and say Chag Sameach. That's right. Now I have a quick quiz. You guys love quizzes. About how old was Mordecai in this story? Anybody have a guess how old Mordecai was? Anybody else? I heard a 70. Going once? 80? Okay. Mordecai was 120. Yes. Yes. He was very old. Yes. Can you believe it? Now, this is just a little introduction. Right after introduction, we're going to listen to the Maccabeats. Many of you know the Maccabeats, and then we're going to start reading the book of Esther. Now, the kids just did a wonderful play. Let's give the kids a big hand on the book of Esther. Now they'll recognize me. All right. You know what is amazing to me is that how long ago did the festival of Purim happen? Does anybody have any idea? It was like, yes. It was close. The whole event that we're celebrating tonight happened about 2,400 years ago. Now, think about how far back that is. 2,400 years, and today is the 13th of Adar. This is the very day all the Jews were to be killed. Think about it. We're here celebrating the fact that they didn't die. And this party has been going on every year for 2,400 years. That is incredible. And to think that today, when we're reading the book of Esther in chapter 3, it was on the 13th day of the first month, which now is Nisan. Okay, that's next month. A month from now is the 13th day of Nisan. That's when they decided that they wanted to kill all the Jews on this day, about a year later. Okay, so they had the decree to kill the Jews going for about a year. In other words, the Jews had a year to prepare or get the heck out of there or whatever they wanted to do. Okay, now, how many of you have heard of Haman? Okay, where did Haman come from? What tribe or nation? Amalek. They were Amalekites. Amalek. Exactly. Now, what do we know about Amalek? Who was Amalek? Where did they come into our story? We're doing a Purim quiz today. Brother Bill knows. Come on, Brother Bill. Amalek. Where does Amalek first appear? Okay, after the Passover, when they're leaving Egypt, they're going into the promised land, Amalek was the first of the nations to try to kill the Jews. They were the very first ones to want to kill them. And this is why in Deuteronomy 25, God says that I want you to remember what Amalek did. And guess who Amalek attacked? They didn't come to the front. They attacked from behind. All the widows and the elderly and the children. That's who they attacked. And that is why God said that they are to blot out the name of Amalek and don't forget to blot them out. Do you know why Amalek attacked them? Why did Amalek attack them? I tell you what, here's the event that happened just prior to them being attacked by Amalek. It says in Exodus that they had rebelled and they were whining and complaining, and they tempted the Lord, and they said, "Is the Lord among us or not?" And then came Amalek. So whenever we whine and complain, we're bringing an Amalek experience. And then listen to this. In Exodus 17, verse 13 through 16, Amalek and Joshua are fighting. Remember that you have the big war going down with Moses, and his hands are being held up. Well, what's fascinating about that, God says, "I will utterly put out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven." And Moses built an altar and called the name of it Jehovah Nissi. Who knows what Jehovah Nissi means? The Lord is my banner. And then it says, the Lord has sworn that the Lord is going to have war with Amalek from generation to generation. Do you know what that means? Every generation there will be a country that wants to destroy Israel. That's what that's referring to. But I think it's interesting that they called the place Jehovah Nissi, which means the Lord is our banner, because in the Song of Songs, which is all about the groom and the bride, he describes her as an army with banners. And so I find that very interesting. Now, here's one more thing. Did you know Amalek was mentioned 100 years before he was even born? How many knew that? Amalek was mentioned in the Bible 100 years before he was even born, and that is in Genesis 14, 7, and 8. But here's what's amazing. Genesis 14, 7, and 8. But then in Genesis 36, Esau is the father of Amalek. Well, do you know Amalek, the first letter is what in Amalek? A. Aleph. The Aleph. And the last letter of Amalek is the Kaf, the K sound, the Kaf. Well, do you know from the first time when Amalek is mentioned, before he was born, the first letter Aleph, all the way to the second time he's mentioned when he is born, to that final letter Kaf of Amalek, there are 12,110 letters. I know, which just so happens is the same amount of Hebrew letters in the book of Esther. In the whole book of Esther, there's the same number of letters as there is between the two times Amalek is mentioned. Okay, now, what was the king of Amalek's name? What? Agag. Agag. All right. And who was supposed to kill Agag and all the Amalekites? And what was Saul's daddy's name? Kish. Kish. All right. You got that? All right. You get a prize. Okay, now Saul did not utterly destroy the Agag. And so guess what? 500 years later comes the book of Esther. And Mordecai was the son of Saul, and Haman is a son of Agag, who Saul refused to kill. It's the whole thing. This is why God said to Saul, you better do it, because 500 years later, if you don't, they're both going to be coming back. All right, so that's just my little intro as we begin the book of Esther. And let's have our first reader come up. And this time, every time you hear the name of Esther or Mordecai or Haman, you can all go yay or boo and shake your groggers. Reader number 1. Oh, wait. Yes. Oh, we're going to have the video of the Maccabeats first. But you can stay up here. You can cheer everybody on. How was that, Bill? No volume. I knew we had to do something.
We don't talk about Haman, la, la, la. We don't talk about Haman. But in your 12 of the king, recently promoted, he was casting lots for every day. Lands on a dart aimed at Jews near and far. Is this the end for the tribe? Haman says, hey king, see here. They disobey us with no fear. Grinning ear to pointy ear.
What a heinous fool, you gotta know.
We don't talk about Haman, nah, nah, nah. We don't talk about Haman.
Haman's really clever, he's malevolent and cunning. Paid a lot of silver just to get his mission running. We associate him with the sound of casting lots. Rage in his heart, Mordecai wouldn't bow down. Queen's gambit opening, manipulate the crowd. The king is the pawn and Haman calls the shots. Haman calls the shots.
Standing at the gate, idol round his neck. If you don't bow down, you might just be next. Yeah, he haunts your dreams. His name makes you scream. We don't talk about Haman, nah, nah, nah. We don't talk about Haman.
Gallows of 50 arms meant for my head. Nah, nah. I tore all my shorts and robes from what he had said.
He wrote in every script and language how he wanted us dead. We faced defeat with the edicts being read. In your 12 of the king, recently promoted, he was casting lots for every day. Is this the end for the tribe? Says he can see here.
Don't talk about Haman. We talk about Haman. Not a word about Haman. She's the new queen at your service, and they can't know that she's not Persian. She's got towers, she's got perches, ought to show that she knows what her worth is. She don't ask how hard the work is. Got a quiet, infallible service. Diamonds and platinum, king's got 'em. She has 'em, she loves what she's handed. She follows commandments, but she's feeling nervous. She doesn't know if her efforts will save us or if they're gonna hurt us. She's feeling nervous. Her people need help. She asks, am I worthy? Did I earn this? She's feeling nervous. Was all she went through worthless? How can she be of service? The law is whack. Our people wearing sacks and covered up in black. She wants her nation's back. She was big for the Persian crown. Whoa. Esther, but she'll trip if she doesn't look down. Whoa. Gotta face her fears and this heavy burden. If she doesn't want to see her people's final curtain, how does she decide which play does she call? After all, she's Esther with a grip that'll never fade. Whoa. Esther and stick with the plan she made. Whoa. She'll walk up to the throne, up before the scepter. Am I Hadassah or am I Esther? Here she is, I know she's got what it takes. No cracks, no breaks, no mistake, she's Esther.
Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this was the Ahasuerus who reigned over 120 27 provinces from India to Ethiopia. In those days, when King Ahasuerus sat in the throne of his kingdom, when he sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, the citadel, that in the 3rd year of his reign he made a feast for all his officials and servants, the powers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of the provinces being before him, when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. And when these days were completed, the king made a feast, lasting 7 days for all the people who were present in Shushan the citadel, from great to small, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were white and blue linen curtains, fastened with cords of fine linen, and purple on silver rods and marble pillars. And the couches were of gold and silver, on a mosaic pavement of alabaster, turquoise, and white and black marble. And they served drinks in golden vessels, each vessel being different from the other, with royal wine in abundance, according to the generosity of the king. In accordance with the law, the drinking was not compulsory, for so the king had ordered all the officers of his household that they should do according to each man's pleasure. Queen Vashti also made a feast for the women in the royal palace, which belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing her royal crown, in order to show her beauty to the people and the officials, for she was beautiful to behold. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, brought by his eunuchs. Therefore the king was furious, and his anger burned within him. Then the king said to the wise men who understood the times, for this was the king's manner toward all who knew law and justice, those closest to him being Karshena, Zethar, Abmatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Menucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who had access to the king's presence and who ranked highest in the kingdom. What shall we do with Queen Vashti according to law, because she did not obey the command of King Ahasuerus brought to her by her eunuchs? And Menucan answered before the king and the princes, Queen Vashti has not only wronged the king, but also all the princes and all the people who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will become known to all women, so that they will despise their husbands in their eyes when they report King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought in before him, but she did not come. This very day, the noble ladies of Persia and Media will say to all the king's officials that they have heard of the behavior of the queen. Thus there will be excessive contempt and wrath. If it pleases the king, let a royal decree go out from him, and let it be recorded in the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it will not be altered, that Vashti shall come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. When the king's decree, which he will make, is proclaimed throughout all his empire, for it is great, all wives will honor their husbands, both great and small. And the reply pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memucan. Then he sent letters to all the king's provinces, to each province in its own script, and to every people in their own language, that each man should be master in his own house, and speak in the language of his own people.
After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus subsided, he remembered Vashti, what she had done and what she had been decreed against her. Then the king's servants who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be brought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins to Shushan, the citadel, into the women's quarters under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, custodian of the women, and let beauty preparations be given them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This thing pleased the king, and he did so. In Shushan, the citadel, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai. Ooh. Yay. The son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjaminite. Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives who had been captured with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. Then Mordecai, had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. When her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So it was when the king's command and decree were heard, and when many young women were gathered at Shushan, the citadel, under the custody of Haggai, that Esther, also was taken to the king's palace into the care of Haggai, the custodian of the women. Now the young woman pleased him, and she obtained his favor. So he readily gave beauty preparations to her besides her allowance. Then 7 choice maidservants were provided for her from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maidservants to the best place in the house of the women. Esther had not revealed her people or family, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it. And every day Mordecai placed in front of the court of the women's quarters to learn of Esther's welfare and what was happening to her. Each young woman's turn came to go in to King Ahasuerus after she had completed 12 months' preparation, according to the regulations for the women, for thus were the days of their preparation appointed: 6 months with oil of myrrh, 6 months with perfumes, and preparations for beautifying women. Thus prepared, each young woman went to the king, and she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the woman's quarters to the king's palace. In the evening she went, and in the morning she returned to the second house of the women, to the custody of Shaddai, the king's eunuch, who kept the concubines. She would not go in to the king's again unless the king delighted in her and called for her by name. Now when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter to go into the king, she requested nothing but that Haggai, the king's eunuch, the custodian of the women, advised. And Esther obtained favor, yay, in the sight of all who saw her. So Esther was taken to, yay, King Ahasuerus into the royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther, yay, more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. So he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast, the feast of Esther, yay, for all his officials and servants, and he proclaimed a holiday in the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of the king.
After these things, the king Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes who were with him. And all the king's servants who were within the king's gate bowed and paying homage to Haman. For so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai would not bow or pay homage. Then the king's servants who were within the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" Now it happened when they spoke to him daily, and he would not listen to them, that they told it to Haman to see whether Mordecai's words would stand. For Mordecai had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow or pay homage, Haman was filled with wrath. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him of the people of Mordecai. Instead, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur, that is, the lot, before Haman determined the day and the month, until it fell on the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Until it fell on the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from all others peoples, and they do not keep the king's laws. Therefore, it is not fitting for the king to let them remain. If it pleases the king, let a decree be written that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver under the hands of those who do the work, to bring it into the king's treasures." So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, "The money and the people are given to you, to do with them as seems good to you." Then the king's scribes were called on the 13th day of the first month, and a decree was written according to all that Haman commanded. To the king's satraps, to the governors who were over each province, to the officials of all people, to every province according to its script, and to every people in their language. In the name of King Ahasuerus it was written and sealed with the king's signet ring. And the letters were sent by couriers into all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, little ones and women, on one day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their possessions. A copy of the document was to be issued as law in every province, being published to all people, that they should be ready for that day. The couriers went out, hastened by the king's command, and the decree was proclaimed in Shushan, the citadel. So the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Shushan was perplexed.
When Mordecai learned all that had happened, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the midst of the city. He cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went as far as front of the king's gate, for no one might enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. And in every province where the king's command and decree arrived, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. So Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her, and the queen was deeply distressed. Then she sent garments to clothe Mordecai and take his sackcloth away from him, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, who had been appointed to attend her, and she gave him a command concerning Mordecai, to learn what and why this was. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the city square that he was in front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told him all that had happened to him, and the sum of the money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries to destroy the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the written decree for their destruction, which was given at Shushan. Then he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, that he might command her to go into the king to make supplication to him and plead for him for their people. So Hathach returned and told Esther the words of Mordecai. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and gave him a command to Mordecai. All the king's servants and all the people of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court to the king who has not been called, he has but one law, put all to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter, that he may live. Yet I myself have not been called to go into the king these 30 days. So they told Mordecai Esther's words. And Mordecai told them to answer Esther, "Do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, "Go, gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan, and fast for me. Neither eat nor drink for 3 days, day or night. My maids and I will fast likewise. And so I will go to the king, which is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther had commanded him.
Now it happens on the 3rd day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, across from the king's house, while the king sat on his royal throne in the royal house, facing the entrance of the house. So it was when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the courts, that she found favor in his sight, and the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther went near and touched the top of the scepter, and the king said to her, "What do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request?" "It shall be given to you upon to half the kingdom." So Esther answered, "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come to the banquet that I have prepared for him." Then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly, that he may do as Esther has said." So the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther had prepared. At the banquet of wine, the king said to Esther, "What is your petition? It shall be granted you. What is your request? Up to half the kingdom it shall be done. Then Esther answered and said, my petition and request is this. If I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if I pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, then let the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them. And tomorrow I will do as the king has said. So Haman went out that day joyfully and with glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and that he did not stand or tremble before him, he was filled with indignation against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. And he sent and called for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Then Haman told them of this great riches and multitude of his children, everything in which the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and servants of the king. Moreover, Haman said, besides, Queen Esther invited no one but me to come in with the king to the banquet that she prepared, and tomorrow I am again invited by her along with the king. Yet all this avails me nothing. So long as I see Mordecai, the Jew, sitting at the king's gate. Then his wife Zeresh and all of his friends said to him, let a gallows be made 50 cubits high, and in the morning suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it. Then go merrily with the king to the banquet. And this pleased Haman, so he had the gallows made.
All right, chapter 6. That night the king could not sleep. So one was commanded to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers, who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Then the king said, what honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? And the king's servants who attended him said, nothing has been done for him. So the king said, who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to suggest that the king hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. The king's servant said to him, Haman is there standing in the court. And the king said, let him come in. So Haman came in, and the king asked him, what shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? And Haman answered the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let a royal robe be brought which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, which was a royal crest placed on its head. Then let this robe and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most notable princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor. Then parade him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Then the king said to Haman, take the robe and the horse, as you have suggested, and do so for Mordecai, the Jew who sits within the king's gate. Leave nothing undone of all that you have spoken. So Haman took the robe and the horse, arrayed Mordecai, and led him on horseback through the city square, and proclaimed before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Afterward, Mordecai went back to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning and with his head covered. When Haman told his wife Zeresh and all of his friends everything that had happened to him, his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, if Mordecai before whom you have begun to fall is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him. While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuch came and hastened to bring Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared.
So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. And on the second day at the banquet of wine, the king said again, Esther, what is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request up to half the kingdom? It shall be done. Then Queen Esther answered and said, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss. So King Ahasuerus answered and said to Queen Esther, who is he, and where is he? Who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing? And Esther said, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. So Haman was terrified before the king and queen. And the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. When the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, will he also assault the queen while I am in the house? As the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Now Harbona, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, look, the gallows, 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman. Then the king said, hang him on it. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's wrath was subsided.
On that day, King Ahasuerus gave Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. So the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed Mordecai over the house of Haman. Now Esther spoke again to the king, fell down at his feet, and implored him with tears to counteract the evil of Haman, the Agagite, and the scheme which he had devised against the Jews. And the king held out the golden scepter toward Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king and said, if it pleases the king, and if I found favor in his sight, and the thing seems right to the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, which he wrote to annihilate the Jews who are all in the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the evil that will come to my people? How can I endure to see the destruction of my countrymen? And then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, indeed, I've given Esther the house of Haman. And they hung him on the gallows because he tried to lay his hand on the Jews. Then he said, you yourselves write a decree concerning the Jews as you please in the king's name, seal it with the king's signet ring, for whatever is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring, no one can revoke. So the king's scribes were called at that time in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day, and it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded. To the Jews, satraps, governors, princes of the provinces from India all the way to Ethiopia, 127 provinces in all, to every province in its own language, to every people in their own language, to the Jews in their own script and language. And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus, sealed it with the king's signet ring, and sent letters by couriers on horseback, riding on royal horses bred from swift steeds. By these letters, the king permitted the Jews who were in every city to gather together and protect their lives, to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the forces of anybody or province that would try to assault them, their little children and women, to plunder their possessions on one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. On the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, today. A copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province and published for all people, so that the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers who rode on royal horses went out, hastened and pressed on by the king's command, and the decree was issued in Shushan, the citadel. So Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel, a blue, white, great crown of gold, garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. The Jews had light and gladness, joy and honor, and in every province, the city, wherever the king's command and decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a holiday. Then many of the people of the land decided to become Jews because the fear of the Jews fell upon them.
Okay, so this is chapter 9. Now in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, the time came for the king's command and his decree to be executed. On the day that the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, the opposite occurred, in that the Jews themselves overpowered those who hated them. The Jews gathered together in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm. And no one could withstand them, because the fear of them fell upon all the people. And all the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and all those doing the king's work helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. For Mordecai was great in the king's palace, and his fame throughout all the provinces. For this man, Mordecai, became increasingly prominent. Thus the Jews defeated all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, with slaughter and destruction, and did what they pleased with those who hated them. And in Shushan, the citadel, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. Also, Harshandatha, Dalphon, Ashpatha, Paratha, Adaliah, Aradatha, Harmashta, Erisheh, Eridai, and Bajahatha, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hamadatha, the enemy of the Jews, they killed. But they did not lay a hand on the plunder. On that day, the number of those who were killed in Shushan the citadel was brought to the king. And the king said to Queen Esther, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men in Shushan the citadel, and the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? And it shall be granted to you. And what is your further request? It shall be done. Then Esther said, "If it pleases the king, let it be granted to the Jews who are in Shushan to do again tomorrow according to today's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows." So the king commanded this to be done, and the decree was issued in Shushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons. And the Jews who were in Shushan gathered together again on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and killed 300 men at Shushan. But they did not lay a hand on the plunder. Okay, this says the Feast of Purim. So we're going to talk next about the Feast of Purim here. The remainder of the Jews in the king's provinces gathered together and protected their lives, had rest from their enemies, and killed 75,000 of their enemies, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. This was on the 13th day of the month of Adar. And on the 14th day of the month, they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. But the Jews who were at Shushan assembled together on the 13th day as well as on the 14th. And on the 15th of the month, they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore, the Jews of the villages who dwelt in the unwalled towns celebrated the 14th day of the month of Adar with gladness and feasting as a holiday, and for sending presents to one another. And Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters to all the Jews near and far who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, to establish among them that they should celebrate yearly the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar as the days on which the Jews had rest from their enemies, as the month which turned from sorrow to joy for them, and from mourning to a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, of sending presents to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews accepted the custom which they had begun, as Mordecai had written to them, because Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to annihilate them, and had cast pur, that is the lot, to consume them and destroy them. But when Esther came before the king, she commanded by letter that this wicked plot which Haman had devised against the Jews would return upon his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. So they called these days Purim, after the name Pur. Therefore, because of all the words of this letter that they had seen concerning this matter, and what had happened to them, the Jews established and imposed it upon themselves and their descendants and all who would join them, that without fail they should celebrate these 2 days every year, according to the written instructions and according to the prescribed time, that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city, that these days of Purim should not fail to be observed among the Jews, and that the memory of them should not perish among their descendants. Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, with Mordecai, the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter about Purim. And Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus with words of peace and truth to confirm these days of Purim at their appointed time, as Mordecai, the Jew, and Queen Esther had prescribed for them, and as they had decreed for themselves and their descendants concerning matters of their fasting and lamenting. So the decree of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was written in the book.
chapter 10. And King Ahasuerus imposed tribute on the land and on the islands of the sea. Now all the acts of his power and his might, and the account of the greatness of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second to King Ahasuerus, and was great among the Jews, and well received by the multitude of his brethren, seeking the good of his people, and speaking peace to all his countrymen.
And that concludes the book of Esther. Yay! I have just a real short teaching, but first I want to make a couple of announcements. Let's see, where did they go? Okay, first off, Lance and Shani had their grandchild this morning. About 6 pounds, 5 ounces. His name is Colt James, and he was born about 7 a.m. this morning. Now, because Lance and Shani are gone, there will be no Tuesday night midrash here coming up this week. And Joe Cornelius, who's around the corner, celebrates his 70th birthday today. Yay! I have a feeling there was another announcement, but I don't remember it. So unless someone tells me, we're going to skip it. Okay. The short teaching actually comes from Lance. Lance prepared all of this, not knowing he wasn't going to be here. So he asked me to share it, so I looked through it, and I'm not going to share it as well as he would share it, and I'm not going to cover everything. But there's something that's very fascinating I do want to share with you through this. And if you remember, what we read was, now it happened on the 3rd day that Esther put on her royal robes. Remember that sentence? Okay, first off, what day of the month is that? The 3rd day. Now what? Okay, well, do you remember how long did she fast? 3 days. And what day did she start fasting? The 13th day of Nisan. What's on the 14th of Nisan? Passover. This whole event is happening during Passover, and she rises before the king the same time Messiah rises before the king. Timing is very significant. But she has on her royal robes, right? Well, here's the thing. Those of you that know Hebrew, the word for garments or robe is beged. Okay, B-G-D. In Hebrew, the Beit Gimel Dalet. But that's not the word in this text. The word instead to clothe yourself is tilbash, okay, which means to put on or clothe oneself, which is what she did. She put on the royal robes. Examples of this are found in Job 29:14. But listen, he says, I put on or clothe myself in righteousness. It's not physical clothing. It says, and the righteousness clothed me. We also find in Psalm 104:1, speaking of Hashem, you are clothed with glory and majesty. So what was it she actually put on? From these two examples, we can see that the clothing of oneself is not always meant in the physical sense. Okay, and as I said, in Hebrew, when that is said, it doesn't use the normal word. Okay, now, the next thing, it says here that in one of the sages' explanation, it says that it should have said Esther clothed herself in royal garments. Rather, this alludes to the fact that she clothed herself with the Ruach HaKodesh, the divine spirit of inspiration. Just as is written in 1 Chronicles 12:19, it says how the Spirit clothed Amasai. So she was being clothed with the Ruach HaKodesh, or the Holy Spirit. Okay, so Esther, they say, was actually a prophetess clothed with the Spirit. Let's see. And so the thing that we also find out as you look at this, because one of the other words in that sentence is Malkut, which means the kingdom. So she, and the fact that it is in the imperfect tense, not the perfect tense, and what that means is, the imperfect tense means she started, but it's not completed. The perfect tense means she completed the action, but it's imperfect. So the point is, just as we pursue holiness, we are holy while we are in its pursuit, because we won't attain perfection in this life, but we still dress ourselves continually with the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit. And so Esther realized that in order to receive a response from above, there has to be an action here below. This is why in 1 Peter 3:3, it says, don't let your clothing be merely outward, your hair, wearing of gold, putting on fine apparel. Rather, let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the incorruptible beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit. For in this manner, in former times, the holy women who trusted in God also adorned themselves, referring specifically to Esther. And this is in 1 Peter 3:3. And if you remember in Colossians chapter 3, 12 through 14, it says, therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, we're supposed to put something on. And what are we to put on? Tender mercies, kindness, humility, meekness, long-suffering, bearing with one another, forgiving one another. Okay, this is what we're supposed to do, forgiving one another. And then it says, above all these things, put on love, which is the bond of perfection. Now he has here also, many of you are familiar with the parable in Matthew chapter 22 of the wedding feast. And one guy came in and he did not have on the wedding garment. Okay, well, one of the sages defined, of course, he didn't read the New Testament, and this is long before it was written, but it comes from Zechariah. Also, it talks about the king's children who are clothed in strange apparel. What is that referring to? Well, he says the garments we're to be clothed with are the mitzvot, or the good deeds of the Torah. In Ephesians 6, 11 through 13, everyone knows is supposed to put on what? The whole armor of God. So here's the thing. Since the whole book of Esther is about the Amalekites, we find out overcoming Amalek is only accomplished by fasting, prayer, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. With that said, we're going to go eat treats in the back. So, greet one another. Hagsamayot.